Good afternoon. I am Richard Ackley. Today is September 6th, 2024. I'm doing a presentation on the Hebrew Bible, the first 5 books, for a sharing with my mentors for the seminary course I'm taking. Before I do that, I'd like to just give a little overview of my style of learning. During my spiritual and biblical formation, my awareness is based upon a structured context. As a child and a teenager, my understanding was the result of pre-1960 Roman Catholic understanding of the Old Testament, which was limited at the best. Of course, the narratives of Genesis, Exodus was more based upon a limited understanding of the historic biblical narratives. My core cognitive mapping is a specific. In college, I had a contemporary Western religious heritage class where I gained a little more understanding of the Old Testament. For me, in my indigenous context, each person needs to have the basic awareness of the many translations over 20 centuries of this religious belief system. My formation is guided by a deep sense of place and my cultural foundation as an indigenous Christian. My goal, which is to find my own balance, which is traditionally is the tension of this awareness. Of course, each person has a different journey, and my role is to ensure what is understood and to provide space for learning and awareness without manipulation of the specific biblical narratives. As I reflect upon my understanding and analysis of the Hebrew Bible, the CARE approach is one that fits my own contextual understanding as presented in this book. My cognitive mapping style is one of an oral tradition, and my narratives is always based upon how I see the experience based upon my tribal community context, which is really faith-based in the North. I grew up in a very strong tribal community, Battle River Band of Lake Spirit, Chippewa. My grandparents never pushed me to any type of religious experience, and I believe that has benefited me because I can view things in a little different format. Historically, this model could have been viewed as a pre-modernist, or as I say, a mosaic of my understanding of the Old Testament, and for that matter, the New Testament, as I continue with these seminary courses. That kind of is the overview. Throughout my educational journey, there will be more videos pertaining to my style of learning, which is to express myself and to integrate the processes and to express it as a indigenous Christian. That concludes my overview.
Okay, so I'm the interviewer, Tim Webster, and I work with an organization called Native University that Richard is resident elder and advisor for. And I'm an enrolled Oneida. So one of the convictions I've had over the years talking with Richard is that often indigenous perspective on the Bible brings new insights to the scriptures for a couple of reasons. One is, I think, because indigenous people, often tribal people, can identify with the kind of life that people in the Old Testament are living more closely for a number of reasons. But another one is that indigenous people, and I think Richard is a great example of this, brings a kind of a pre-modern sensibility to the text. And so he doesn't read it with some of the same hang-ups maybe that modern rationalist or Western people might read the text. And so, with that kind of in mind, I'm going to ask a question about each book. The first question has to do with Genesis 6. This is the flood story in the book of Genesis. Now, some people see this as a story about resilience in a catastrophe, sort of an archetypal human story. So things like, what are the reasons for catastrophes, and how does a people group and individuals, how do they survive these catastrophes? So Richard, how do you feel Native people might read this story differently than modern majority Americans? That is the flood story. What does it say to you about resilience in catastrophe?
It would be two aspects. One is the traditional model of Western religion would be the creation, the Genesis, and you said the flood. I would take it a little differently as an indigenous person from northern Wisconsin. In fact, other tribes across the country would take it too. Where I'm from in the north, we would have a spring flood, but what would cause that would be the dams from up the river. So when White River would flow in and when Bad River would flow, the water would get higher and they would just flow out. Historically, when the land became colonized in the area where I'm from in the 1914, early 1900s, there were 2,000 people. And when the trees were all cut, the big pine, the location where I'm from was a natural portage from Lake Superior over to the Mississippi. So my context of flood, the way the biblical would be creation. My context in an indigenous model would be that if the environment is changed, the creation is changed, we don't live with the environment, then we deplete, and then we have other factors that create more conflict. So there'd be two ways for you to look at that. One is the resiliency would be, or the definition would be one of protection of the environment so it isn't contaminated. Many Native people across the Americas or the hemispheres have a context of we live within the environment. And historically, I always said where cultural and environment coexist. In the biblical tradition, it is the impact of a story narrative of creation, of Genesis, of formation, to present for the Hebrew people that the creation was one of the big, I'd call it like the Big Bang or the big experience. Our context of creation was not one of, would not follow that. I would understand it, but it wouldn't fit in my belief system in an indigenous context.
Okay, thanks. So this idea of, well, I don't know if you use the word harmony, but sort of harmony with the created order, harmony with creation, and when you're talking about people cutting down trees or making conditions that might lead to a flood, you're seeing them as sort of an imbalance of in a disharmony with creation or an imbalance in nature. Am I hearing that correctly?
Correct, yeah. And the key here in my mind are the format is the context of maybe it's the colonists of the great destiny of wanting to conquer the wilderness. And that's not something you conquer. You try to live within the context of that. And I alluded to the dam, but today in 2024, with solar energy, with other activities, you have other options. So the harmony of the environment could be probably brought back. The difficulty with the flood story, it got to be so manifested in symbolism And if you go to, I don't know if it's Tennessee, they have the ark, the story. And Moses, or the whole storyline could be of how the person or the prophet adapted to the environment. That makes sense to me, but if I didn't have that indigenous context, I would probably be a person who would support that narrative, because there's no other options for people who didn't trace their own experiences. Every culture in the world has had to deal with this model of the changing of the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and perhaps when things go wrong. Well, and that's, so there's an interesting, so I wonder what you think about this. So there is an imbalance in this story. There is something going wrong. In particular, what it mentions is sort of a moral imbalance. So Noah's a good person, but what's happening all around the land here is what God sees is violence and corruption. So people being violent against each other, and so is this an element that you see in your own perspective, in your own culture too? This idea that human violence can be what throws nature out of harmony?
When I prepared myself for this video this afternoon, I reviewed God is Red, and by Vine Deloria, and what I believe, and after just reviewing it, the book, I haven't read it for a while, I just kind of pulled it together. The context is not the context of violence. The context could be, in my estimation, the context of taking a creation story and making it the attachments of too many narratives of greed, violence, and really, in my estimation, that could be a reflection of the Western religious model. The Martin Luther with the whatever the theory is of the things of Reformation. And in the culture that I'm from, the events of natural events, of storylines, it could be earthquake, it could be tornado, it could be other things. I don't believe and I'm not, the Bible's been around for 22 centuries. As a scripture context, the attachment of those violence, those terms perhaps do not fit an indigenous creation story. So I would have to say, this is what the Hebrew model is, and this is what our model is. Because in the context of a hunting, fishing, and gathering society, you lived in an environment that you had to provide, and the storylines of conflict, even in the narratives. We have something in the Ojibwe culture where in the wintertime, we wanted to keep you off the ice. So the Wendigo psychosis, or the Wendigo, is the ice monster or something that devours you. So there's a context of fear, but the fear was one of safety, not one of violence.
So the question I have from Exodus is a story that interests me from Exodus 32, chapter 32. So this is the golden calf story. So this is a story where Moses is receiving a vision from God, and it's sort of a high point because they finally arrived and they're hearing from God. But in the middle of this, things just kind of go off the rails with the people, so this is of course a big theme throughout the whole Old Testament, but it shows up here, and I'd like to hear sort of you give a native understanding of this human tendency. this human tendency towards, maybe you could call it chaos, maybe you could call it moral decay, maybe you could call it just giving up on higher principles that, that we see sort of illustrated in this golden calf story. So even at the high point of their story, things kind of go off the rails. Why don't you comment on what you see in that story?
Okay, in the Ojibwe, or in the narrative that I'm part of, even though I use the context of Ojibwe or Anishinaabe or the spontaneous human being, I often reflect that I don't have to have external factors for my belief system or even knowing the language, because I understand. I was raised by grandparents who spoke the language, so they always emphasized their narrative. I would say, in the context of this storyline about the golden calf, or the folks or the people of the celebration, you could be celebratory up to a point, but you still have to maintain your lifestyle. And this is a constant theme in the tradition that I'm part of. In the 12 months of the year, you always have a backup system. Recently, in the month of August, the harvesting of wild rice took place, but if a big storm came and a natural creation, you would be caught with depletion of the wild rice. Therefore, people who have not of faith of our tradition, indigenous, would either succumb to anxiety, succumb to no purpose. So therefore, what one would have to do in that is find a way to, you go into the duck season, or the deer, or the venison, or the fishing. You adjust to the context of food. And in the native tradition, the reason why you offer an offering in the contemporary model, or this could be overworked, the context of offering to bring one animal to feed your family, because they were small gatherings, hunting, fishing, and gathering. I've often tell a story where a animal biologist friend of mine showed where there was a deer carcass, and the animal, it was a video cam. Each species went at a different time of the night to get the food. So I would say the golden calf story would be a reflection of fixation upon the menu of just the food aspect of it, and that created inability to think of another substitution in the indigenous context. So therefore, then we, in the world that I'm from, and every culture would have that. In the North, I often, like, I'm wearing the designs of the blueberries, the strawberries, the raspberries, and the key in all this is the purity of the water, and then other aspects of maintaining your lifestyle. And so for me, the lack of faith of your own cultural norms is what I would tend to think my instincts would be. That's where things went off the rails with the calf and with the because you can celebrate, but in my culture, there's celebration, but there's a continuity of the reality of your life. You're never high or low. Well, you're constant in the movement of caring for your family, of survival, but it's not survival as a desperate. It's the flow of what you would substitute, because you're trying to maintain a lifestyle throughout that year, but there's always the interruptions created by maybe where some of the food is out of harmony. And when you lived in these areas, if somebody came in to deplete your resources, whether it be deer, wild rice, then that's where potential conflict would come in. You wouldn't have conflict if you negotiate.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So Yeah, you're picking on this theme of I guess inadequacy, not enough resources. Maybe, I mean, that's an interesting way to see this story, because that might be what they're looking at. Maybe they're looking at it as whatever God's trying to provide here, they're worried that it's not enough, and that's why they're breaking faith. And so they try their own plan or whatever. I'm wondering what you think about, if you would just stay a little bit more. You mentioned when people kind of lose faith in their traditions. Can you say a little bit more about what causes people to lose faith in those traditions?
The traditions of faith are lost when it's not existential. The culture I'm from is very abstract. You have to make the connection yourself individually within the context of community. You cannot just produce the language, cannot just produce the symbolism, you have to produce the relational dynamic within the community. And the difficulty of Western religion is they have placed the I more important than the we. So you're trying to integrate the nurturance of that individual within the society. That's where the naming ceremonies come in, that's where the experience comes in, that's where the elders come in. But today, in 2024, it gets to be, right now we can find out as much as we want about the Old Testament, the New Testament, artificial intelligence. What we cannot find is the intergenerational model that's going to support these kinds of connections. So I would say that would be an approach that would give a stronger faith if you're connected. We mouth community, we talk about community, but the structure of legalistic, and maybe that's where the legal terms get in, when you have a church denomination that's worrying about its non-profit status, when you have a church denomination that's based upon bishops, priests, and deacons, and lay, and I've been a big advocate of mutual ministry, that has to be a format. And one can discern their process of ordination at any age, in my opinion. But because it's a career model, not a nurturance model, and generational, that's where I believe the context of the format is not helpful. So it's how you balance out. It's so standard in the tribal tradition, and I am a reflection of a traditionalist generation raised by my grandparents, even though I was born in 1945 at age 78. That generation does not exist anymore. The family farm is gone. The native communities travel across the country, except for some around the world, still have this intergenerational in creation, but you can go any place in the world now, they'll have an iPhone, they'll have these guys. So you have to maintain some degree of cultural transmission, and I believe it starts first with the abstract process within the context of that community tribal system. You hope you can get it within a faith system, but today people are dropping off, and maybe the materialistic model of the economic model of Western technology. People have enough, I would think, but it's how you manage what you have.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I mean, as you were saying that, I just had this image of rather than the Baal, that they're making, sort of this as you were saying that, the image was of, well, it's the iPhone that's kind of the stumbling block here. It's the iPhone, not the Baal, that's distracting people from their traditions and from intergenerationality and from the values of the community. So just one quick other follow-up question, and you touched on this, but one of the things in this story that people see here and might wonder about is sort of a failure of leadership. So you talked about sort of a failure of of the community to hold the values. And then there's also this character of Aaron. So Moses is off, Aaron's in charge. Aaron kind of drops the ball in his leadership in this situation. And I wonder if you could just comment on the role of Native leadership, indigenous leadership, in preserving those, keeping people on the rails.
Yeah, and I believe, and I use my cousin who has passed away at age 84 a year ago, that the Moses-Aaron context would be, if you entrust somebody with leadership, entrust somebody with experience, and you've had enough relationships with that person, when you say, who me, and there's only your abstract relationship with the elder or with Moses, who me is me, then I have to act a certain way. But if there isn't a social covenant of a human relationship based upon trust and based upon a degree of loyalty to both parties, if it becomes a autocratic where the authority is a hierarchical authority, in the culture I'm from, at least I believe this, everyone has a part in the circle. I mean, a little 8-year-old baby is intelligent as an 80-year-old in that context of a specific topic. But where I think happens is the tribal experience has the opportunity to be more mutual support. But back to my cousin, if there's a sense of relationship, a sense of respect, and a sense of responsibility, then maybe in that context, resilience would happen, and then you keep renewing that experience. There's only so many ways to harvest wild rice. It's a natural, but today you can put mechanized rice, and you could put the field and drain the water, then you come the machines, you can create paddy rice in California. But the way it originally was done was the wild rice where I'm from, you would hardly take 2 people, one pulls, one knocks. And you make use of cedar because any other wood species would burn your hands. I often have said, how did that become developed? What does it have to do with the Moses-Aaron story? The Moses can direct the cedar strips. I can say, this is what you have to do for the species. As a child growing up, I never could figure out how you could put a cedar boat in the water and it just leaks. But then when the cedar expands, it tightens up. And in cultures, if you push the boat in too quick, if you don't do things in a manner of the creation or the species, the boat will not go. And if I use a different type of species for the harvesting wild rice, and then the natural flow of that to me, the wild rice experience is one of the best for narratives for how you have to deal with the natural world. There's a process. That's anything you do. But what I believe may have happened is there was a time that both Moses and Aaron may not have listened to one another, may not have trusted one another. The vacuum has to be shared by both. Not, I mean, if you direct, it's not repetition, but that maybe perhaps in my culture, there wasn't this covenant of learning and the covenant of acceptance. And that's been a conflict, because if learning is performance, if learning is presentation, if learning isn't experiential, then learning becomes a manipulated device for authority and recognition, not for, not to help.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I want to reread this story sometime with that lens of hierarchy, and it's interesting. I've never thought about whether Aaron was kind of reverting back to maybe a more hierarchical way of thinking, maybe perhaps that he had experienced in Egypt as a slave. Maybe that's part of the problem. That's interesting. I'll have to take a look at that. So my next question is from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. There's this interesting passage about the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee, basically the things that are supposed to happen every once in a while, not during the normal years, but these special years. There are years, for example, where there's this provision for any cultivated land to be allowed to rest. So you kind of take a break from cultivating your fields every seventh year. And then this year of Jubilee is this year which slaves are freed and land is returned to the original families, so you don't have an accumulation of wealth, for example. What strikes me, though, is that these provisions sort of focus on maybe a way, at least one reading of it would be a sort of, how do you do a reset? How do you get things back the way they're supposed to be? And Sabbath and Jubilee is sort of a way to do a reset. But the provisions in this chapter are all for an agricultural society. And they're for people who farm fields. And I wonder what parallels you see for other kinds of societies, in how your people, how you might read these passages, how you can sort of have these ways to reset to the way things are supposed to be, patterns that kind of periodically reset in your context.
Okay, I would have three specific responses coming from a indigenous hunting, fishing, and gathering society. My three responses would be, since the model of slavery and the matter of agriculture doesn't fit, but I'm taking a little different twist here, I would say the model of trade. Historically, tribes across the country interacted, whether or not we want to believe it or not. So then what you would do, if you traded and you did portages with other tribes, you would have relationship with other tribes where you might give them a little more of the harvest of hunting and fishing and gathering, with the promise of not coming into our territory to destroy. So the negotiations in the Ojibwe experience would be one of generosity, theoretically speaking, because who can prove this, but it makes sense, because you're not out to destroy your enemy or your person in the next area because of some natural or some resetting of their experience. I mean, the land could have been not correct, or something could have been some creation. So in that format, the reason why Ojibwe people spent a lot of time in negotiations as a tribe, or as they knew how to be helpful, because in the treaties, the right to hunt, fish, and gather was always a reserved right. It was olfactory right, where the colonists thought they came in to take the land, the pine, the copper. But even in the late period, they never thought of water, fish, wild rice, those kinds of things. So the approach that I'm taking, and I'll summarize those three, would be, the reset would be, you don't want to create an enemy by having that tribe invade your hunting and fishing and gathering. You try to negotiate with them that we'll give you something more in lieu of payment, perhaps in the future. The other one is, if that's accepted, then you remain harmony within your own sense of place. And the result of that would be a hybrid of trade. One of my friends said he couldn't figure out how the copper from this area wound its way in the southwest. It was that relational dynamic, because sometimes if the wild rice season isn't good, then you have to negotiate with the people that have good harvest. So there was that relational dynamic. It doesn't always have to be conflict, but if you start off with control, exploitation, and depletion of resources, you never get to those elements of negotiation, the element of help. And then when the colonists came in, they created dependencies because they threw all these systems out of whack. So that's the way I would answer that in that format. Now, by me presenting that, I don't believe, even in my review of God in Red, that theory has really been understood. The fact that, now who is going to prove, but it's a nice strategy. And diplomacy is more important, and it's still going on 22 centuries. Diplomacy as we speak is still going on because you're being generous, but you're not being generous. You're not creating dependency, you're creating a reset that something else will be helpful in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one of the things I heard from what you said is that you used the word generosity, I think, this idea of generosity being a way to kind of reset things. That's so interesting. And I'm wondering if that is, now I'm going to ask, this has to do with other cultures, but I'm thinking of things like potlatch, things like giveaways in the Pueblo cultures, these acts of generosity that happen once in a while, kind of like the Jubilee happens once in a while. The acts of generosity are the things that reset. Do you think that's an analog in other indigenous cultures?
Yeah, that's why I'm sure. But see, I can only speak in the context. That's a parallel because what it does, it resets the environment. Because that's back in those days, there wasn't the atomic bomb, there wasn't the drones, there was just living, and there were natural. And even when it's that way. You're trying to help. Maybe that's the model of today of the FEMA model. You're helping people, the USA, whatever it is. But you're not trying to do it where it creates dependency. You're trying to help them through a tragedy or through look what goes on. But then there's a problem too sometimes when people get themselves out of context, where they kind of get into that. As my one friend who wrote a book called Affluenza, they get to the point of wanting too much. Materialistic societies, like with me and my culture, I value wild rice. Another culture might value a deer or a moose or those. But how much does one person need? So I would say the reset, you celebrate if it's a bad year, but you still celebrate because you know how to negotiate a bad year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're living in sort of a game theory of, winner take all, zero sum game, that's not going to work with this indigenous model where I might have a bad harvest this year, but you might have a bad harvest next year. And so you kind of keep that in mind, that because it's not just one person always helping the other. It's sort of this understanding that we're going to be generous towards each other when the need arises.
Yeah, in the context of history, our symbolism are the narratives. What I'm really saying here is that they talk a lot about the collective consciousness. To me, hunting, fishing, gathering societies had movement. Agriculture's, they're stationary. So we benefited from our movement. That's where diplomacy and activity, and really it doesn't do a hunting, fishing, gathering society to alienate people. But in the 2024, if you take a position, if you say this, you do that, you have to constantly reset relational dynamics who are out of balance. So that's where I believe some indigenous cultures have the ability to face adversity if they're not trapped in that internalized oppression. And I'm of the opinion we've had this discussion in previous videos, a lot of non-tribal people have not a lot of ability to be resilient. They get trapped in trauma, and that's where the resetting has to take place. They have to remember the stories, but if you don't remember the stories in a healthy way, then you become trapped.
Yeah. Well, there's a reciprocity in an indigenous perspective that is, to me, gives a kind of a fresh reading on this story, because it's easy to read this story as, oh, well, the rich people are just being nice to the poor people, people who have fallen into slavery because they fell into debt, whatever reason. They're being nice to them and freeing them. But from what you're describing, actually, the slaves have something to offer, and freeing them is a way for them to give back to the whole community, and their being free is actually helpful for the slave owners.
Yeah, and we're facing something that they bring this more contemporary. There's less focus now on electrical energy because of solar energy and because of other activities. We're changing some of the options, like no longer do we need, dams are not as important anymore. So as these economic systems are changing, it's like who's pulling the plug? And in the religious world, if you don't adapt to some of your narratives, and it's always in that model of, it's appropriate for people who have an understanding of this, but coming from an indigenous context, as you and I have had this discussion, some tribal people have to approach the learning from an indigenous paradigm, not from a biblical paradigm. And that's really all I'm saying. You just enter it in a model of learning different than you enter it in an adversarial or a defensive posture. You enter it as an interactive process.
Okay, so my next question is from the book of Numbers in the Pentateuch. This is all through the book, but especially right off the bat, chapter 1, you get a whole chapter full of genealogies. And then following right on that, there's a great deal of effort in specifying traditional roles. And I know from my students over the years, and in fact I think many moderns find a lot of these passages very tedious. They don't see any point in genealogies and these kind of relationships. They don't see any point in traditional roles. In fact, moderns might find it contrary to the aspirations of the human spirit. We should be free of our ancestors, and we should be free of any prescribed roles in the community. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of help us understand how might Native people read it differently? How might they see the significance of some of these things that are in the book? Things like genealogies and roles.
I would say spontaneously right now, my context of this genealogy model would be one of forgiveness, redemption, and hope. The reason why I say that is forgiveness means the complexity of human family systems, especially in the Native world, the exploitation of a Native person by virtue of residential schools and colonists. I've been blessed to come out of a genetic cultural experience where my ancestors never went for the annuities. That's not to say people did not go for them. Two, the sense of hope, or the sense of that life will be improved by your knowledge of your history of your past. And it was interesting how the Vine Deloria book this morning, I was reading that God has read, that Native people, and I've used this many times, we have a legalistic definition for quantum, which is a measure of separatism, but somebody else says you're a full blood if you're not a full blood. So I would say in the Native world, in the indigenous world, the incorporation of the spirit, the incorporation of the being part of a family is a result of 22 centuries in the Christian context and the result of thousands of years in the indigenous context. I mean, they're both in that format. But where this is important, I believe cultures around the world, if you don't relate to your genetic or cultural makeup, and if it's always been one of fragmentation, then you have to have a way of healing for that. The difficulty with cultures that have been oppressed, they spend a lot of time in the oppression, not a lot of times in hope and redemption. Hope is movement, redemption is forgiveness. The Creator, Jesus Christ, or the Spirit, allows for the understanding. But to me, knowing tribalism, knowing who your ancestors are, I guess it fits. Some of the historic monographs say the reason why these groups of small family gatherings, the hunting fishing society, would come together in the spring would be for relational dynamics. As you don't have the cousins marrying cousins or sisters, you have, so you get the big gatherings of people, and then those are the interactions. It's not arranged, it's just those kind of deals. So it's important to know your experience, but then the other importance is move out the legalistic context. If you have healthy parents or healthy relationships, two things I often say about this, and this is contemporary, more modern, the orphan train that came through across America. There were babies born, and some Native people went and picked the babies up, and they raised them. They're people who raise children who are not biologically parents. I was raised by my grandparents, but my parents were legally married. For some reason, it happened, and I haven't figured out, not that I need to figure it out, but there was no stigma. Today, that wouldn't happen in 2024, because I, as a tribal judge, would have to have a case study and all these other things. But what I believe happens here is the understanding of your own responsibility to your care of that's important, and that would be a reflection of numbers. And I have often said, if you ever want to, and this is an old family systems theory, in the early 80s there was a book by Carolyn Attany called Family Network Therapy, where you wanted to take 1,000 people and put them in a room, not in a stadium. You would have these bridgers of people who would be able to sort out the conflicts, but you have to bring people in with those 1,000 people. Today, the fragmentation of our culture and the fragmentation of our religious experience is based upon hierarchy, credentials, discernment, formation, and authority. I recognize that we need healthy people, we need good psychological assessments, where men and women, children, no one is exploited, but we have to balance out that, and knowing the analytics, or they use the interesting terms today, knowing how you've come about. And then the other aspect of it, responsibility in the Native world, there's restorative justice, where we're trying to restore people to wholeness. But if you have a system that doesn't present that, so it would be hard for people to compare mathematically, and maybe that's where tribal people, in my mind, in the essence, we have a mathematical, like someone says, who are your ancestors? We just don't say me. We can go back. We abstractly can explain our genetic, the form of genealogies we're part of, to the point we even know when the European person came or someone else came into the system. So by knowing that, then you become, it becomes more helpful. But if you don't come out of something, then you become displaced. In the old, in the 60s, maybe I'm on it because of my age of 78, I'll be 79 this month, the context of aloneness has created such a, suicide, other things. But if you can see yourself in a collective cultural family or model, you would lessen the mental conflicts based upon greed, based upon exploitation, based upon dysfunctionalism. And that might be the importance of the biblical tradition from a pre-modernist, why numbers would reflect, because you're trying to ensure, they use it in the biblical, with the 12 tribes or whatever, you're trying to ensure in this massive amount of humanity of people, there are these relationships that have historic connections.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about this idea of fragmentation, because many people in the West are fragmented along various lines. And then, there's indigenous people who have been, things forced on them, and there's fragmentation there too. And one of the things I've noticed, and tell me if you think I'm onto something here, because I have a small sample here. But one of the things I've noticed is that perhaps the more fragmented people are, the more they focus in on a single aspect of their genealogy. Maybe they only are, if they're indigenous, maybe they're only focusing on how pure blood they are or something. And on the other hand, I've met folks like you and like my friend Moani, for example, who's indigenous native Hawaiian, but she's got a Ukrainian back in her genealogy. And she just embraces all of it. When she talks about who she is, she doesn't leave the Ukrainian out.
Yes, and I would say there has to be a balance of understanding of those historic narratives, because at some point along the line in cultures, people become out of sync, and that's where the mental instability, or whatever you want to call it. That's why elders, uncles, if they're not weird, or aunties, become helpful. But if it's only based upon one external factor, like to me, in 2024, a lot of friends are learning the language, and I may not, but they need to learn are the values, and that's more important. And the reason why in the faith tradition I'm part of, I accept the Episcopal tradition, or any tradition, because in the Native world, our tent is big. We have 3 they're indigenous in a way, Afro-American are part of our family, but our tent, we include people within our family, and they're our sons and daughters or grandchildren or whatever it is. But what happens here is, if you don't believe in that model, then you're going to just be fixated upon one thing, like competition, wealth, credentials. It's important, but it's understanding how you live, and that's where the word harmony, the word relationship to the sense of place where you're at. And in some ways, the parallel of the Old Testament are the parallels of indigenous cultures. It's a model that before we started talking, that I give both foundational principles. As we look forward to the New Testament, the models have to be anchored, not anchored in an anchor, but there's a soil in both of them. So the soil has to be nurtured, but if the soil is depleted, if the energy is depleted, then you're not having a healthy human being culturally. And what I think happens today is we don't, and maybe it fits my process personality, that if you don't define who you are, you don't search out a relational dynamic. We have enough tools today that you have to understand who you are, but you have to do it in the context of your cultural tradition. Now, in some ways, I've noticed people who are, I call them wannabes, and maybe that's like the Christian model where they're sort of so hyped out at being a Christian, they're not relating to the narratives of the Christian faith. They become artificial, and that's not healthy either. You can go through seminary, you become a priest, you can do everything. And if you still have that adversarial model, and it gets back to being the shepherd needs to have a relationship, because what's in the Old Testament, whose sheep were they? Were they Moses or the father-in-law? I don't know. I mean, it's the context of, it's to help, not to be, you have to fit in, you don't, but in this Christian model we're involved in, I'm not being evangelical here, you have to have a relational dynamic with your shepherd, whether it be the bishop, the priest, the deacon, the layperson. I mean, in the culture I'm part of. But if you don't have that, then you become so controlling. Everything is based upon, because of the model of Western model, like, Friday's your day off, or you can't do this. If you can't live and believe your faith as part of your living experience, then your faith is kind of like, I believe it's kind of shallow. So in some ways, the integration of these activities is an ongoing journey. Mm-hmm. And that's so important. And that's why language helps to develop the abstract, but abstract can also benefit from the language. So I want all of them to be included as a holistic model.
Yeah. Well, there's this. Yeah, that's interesting. We've talked about this a lot. This idea that, that attention to integration is important to be, in being a Jesus follower. Because if people are claiming to be Jesus followers and are not attending to integration, then what they're doing is they're maybe trying to take a slice of something, but all the other gifts of creator, like their genealogy, for example, they're neglecting. And how can you receive one gift and not be open to the other gifts? That doesn't seem to work out. And so it's so looking at the book of Numbers is looking at these genealogies is something that brings not only balance but perspective is very interesting.
It creates, like for me, I'm a product or a result of a genetic history, a cultural history, a tribal history, and all those elements have allowed me to present myself in a balanced view. I may take 10% ownership, but it's 90% nurturance.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the book of Deuteronomy, the last question is from the book of Deuteronomy, and of course Deuteronomy repeats a lot of the stuff in the prior books of the Pentateuch, and so I think this material is in here too. But one of the things that strikes me about Deuteronomy is this agency, is this idea that there's this choice that lies before us, and we have the agency to be able to embrace that choice. So in chapter 11, for example, there's this idea that that God, the Lord here, Yahweh, has shown love to the people. Creator has shown love to the people, and they're supposed to love him back. They're supposed to reciprocate that love. And one of the ways they reciprocate the love is in following what he says. And then there's this section here about choose this day, several times here in verse 26. See, I'm setting before you today. There's the Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim thing. There's the blessings and the curses. I'm setting, there's like this choice that's being set before them to reciprocate the Creator's love or not. And I think it's interesting. I'd like to hear you just reflect on this issue of our capacity to choose, our agency in the world, and how you see that.
I would say, as we bring some summary of the 5 books, or whatever you want to call it, I use it in 3 different ways. One of my good friends said to me once, he said, in the religious experience, you may have over 600 rules, and in the Ojibwe experience, you folks have a rule over a rule or a rule, which means you might have 1,800. By that I mean the rules and blessings, if you're dealing with life, it's complicated. And if you learn the complications of life through the Creator and parallel that to the Creator, because we're not talking about Jesus Christ yet, we're talking about the Creator, the Spirit, or what flows through the universe. Why that's important is you will get blessings and joy and abundance if you live a life, you recognize that. But because we come from a human experience, and if you come from a circular world, not a linear world, there will be occasions that the human experience, you'll be out of balance. There will be times when that out of balance may require a strong belief in the Creator and in your nurturance and the acceptance of the Spirit. But what happens here in my relationship is, and maybe it was important, in the model of the Old Testament, but we, as I look back at the cultures and I understand what little I've read, what little I know, we were not a punitive culture. We were not a culture, if these are simplistic narratives, but we had something called the medicine bag, or jibik. You never wanted to invoke any type of anger or maliciousness upon anyone else. Even if you had harmony for joy or for love, what you try to do is create where the blessings of creation is a result of the protocol of the experiences. And when I say we have maybe 6, 7, 1,800, nobody wants to touch that, because when you say a tree, in some cultures, we have 14 or 15 different ways to say a species of a tree. We have certain ways to say relationships. Like for me, and I've done this so many times, I pull this out, and this is a Manitou stone, this is a spirit stone, but any people across the world, the people of the Standing Stone or the Oneidas, the people of the cultures like in Wyoming or the Standing Rock or the Manitou stones. What it is, it's a relationship to the environment. And if you have blessings by the Creator, you'll have a reasonable life to live. If you don't have that, then that's where if you don't have the discipline, or if you break that, that's where you become out of balance. Now, 2024, why this is so important, to at least for me to have an understanding of the pre-modernists of my Ojibwe culture and the understanding of the Old Testament is these environments are present in the culture I'm living today. Not everyone's going to benefit from, I'm 78, I'll be 79. My window of living opportunity is limited, but what it is, I'm hoping to convey the importance of knowing your indigenous experience, the importance of knowing the Old Testament, because the relational dynamics of the generations today, there may be a need to deal with both. If you negate one, you're negating your own cultural mosaic. And there's a danger in people who say they're unchurched. There's a danger because the word church is organizational, but if you say you're not part of your faith community, you're not part of your tribalism, then you are out of sync. So for me, the instructions are brought home are from whatever we have, but with technology and artificial intelligence and experience, you really have to find a way to navigate those extremes. And I believe the historic or all the other terminologies, what one has to do is give equal respect for both experiences. And the danger we have with the Western model, like I was chuckling, reading fast, God is Red. We have Jerusalem, we have Rome, and if we would have done it right, we would have had a circuit place in Germany. Because of the translations, the Reformation, because of Martin Luther. It's a humorous analogy, but if we look at the world in creation, the circular world, and if you look at the world in a circular way, where at times of the three circles, you're the center, sometimes you're pulled you're out of sync. That could be, you get a good job, there's a mini depression. You pull back, you lose a job, there's depression, you pull back. If there's harmony, you have joy. And then within all that, grief, experiences, things just happen. Things happen. I have a good friend who is he has ALS. He's in the process of dying. But what I've noticed with him, he's not a believer, but by him listening to me, he seems to believe in something. And what I'm getting at is it's how you balance out your life pattern, how they're brought home to you. We started this off by me saying, who me? In other words, if you're in a relationship with the Creator or with the Spirit and forecoming, the image or the life of Jesus Christ, means that you have invested in the world. And if the world's in both places, as the old psychological principle, is in your head or is it they're in both places. So the Torah or the model of the verses of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the understanding of the native experience, they have to be given equal weight. But if you don't do that, and I believe it's important because the Western model, I always have great difficulty asking when tribal and non-tribal people tell me, where are you from? Or who are you? there's always a denial of certain aspects of the history of your life. Now, for me, I actually know when the non-tribal person entered our space. I mean, a lot of people don't know that. They're either adopted out or they're either born out of whatever. So in summary, I would say I would look towards the blessings, but I also would monitor the true good medicine, the possibilities of the avenues when you're out of balance. Hopefully, it does not bring you to a hopelessness. And in tribal communities today with dysfunctionalism, if you don't have a sense of hope, you have to put in check, like recently, there's been a big push of understanding residential schools. Not everybody has had a bad experience. What one can balance that out with is with the native theologians, like if you think of Black Elk Speaks or you think of native people, you gotta find a way to give both reverence and respect to your journey. And if I came from a society, and I believe most indigenous societies wanted to live in a reasonably sense of place, a reasonable part of creation, and not in a non-destructive way. Mm-hmm. I have to believe that. Mm-hmm. But it's helped me. Now, hopefully that message can be shared. The closest thing I would say to the Moses, like from what we've been creation stories, were the Turtle Island, the little drummer boy. But the fact that I still have the Spirit Stone, and I still believe in that, is no different than when someone says I have to give either one of them up. Then that keeps me. In summary, I would say I would be out of balance, and that's not my style. And if the new models of theological education, the new models of indigenous education does the incorporation of these two, then one can accept the indigenous paradigm and the Old Testament paradigm. How we deal with the New Testament and the new generations will be a result of the firmness of these foundations.
Interesting. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So that's why I would bring that to summary.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. That's a good spot to end on. I think one of the things that has, I think it's a puzzle a lot of people is how to think of the curses, and because some people want to conceive of them as, punitive. Somebody does something wrong and other people just come down on them. And certainly many laws are punitive. Not all laws are restorative. And then other people want to see it as purely natural consequences of things. And I've heard that idea too, that the curses are that's just the natural consequence. If you punch somebody in the face, you're more likely to get punched in the face yourself. It's just kind of how it works.
But if you duck, which I've done many times, intellectually and socially, and you're diplomatic, you know when to walk away.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty.
And the way you know is it strikes me as kind of a third way here of understanding the curses. Yeah. It's understanding it as out of balance.
Correct. That's why I'm using that term. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know. It strikes me actually. It's just an Augustinian idea that it's not a thing. It's a lack of something.
Yeah.
And so in that way, actually, I think your indigenous sensibility coheres very nicely with this ancient idea of the bad things are the lack of something. What you're adding to the conversation, I think, or keep continually reminding us, is that it's a lack of balance.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I'm looking at a paper I did 42 years ago that I got a B plus on the Holy Spirit and Christian teaching, and it's a King version bit, but I have not changed in my view in 42 years. I mean, it's still the same. Like I say here, the Episcopal Church with its 2 non-Indian clergy have promoted a more sacramental form of church worship and a respect for the special contributions of the other tribe. The people want, and I believe prefer, a more ritualistic service with a clear format of speaking to the gospel. Many members are 4th, 5th generation members. Many still tend to marry within their faith. In other words, I know they're contemplative. I know they're reserved. They're not, I mean, Linda was saying this to me. When the Episcopalians were here, then came the Methodists and Episcopalians, but then came the Roman Catholics, the Assembly of God, and the Mormons. They were picking pieces in the vineyard. But the people that are still there, like, I do this all the time with others. I always honor your grandfather. I mean, it's almost like it's automatic, nothing to do with you. It has to do with him. No, I mean, but the key, though, is just imagine that, well, here it is, says, the traditions, development of the Oneida tribe, traditions can be in harmony with the Oneida tribe, their traditions can be in harmony with the Christian tradition. Now, I said that 42 years ago, and they're still struggling with the harmony, the Longhouse and the Oneida experience. I mean, that's not, the role of the Episcopal Church, development of the Oneida tribe, the influence of the Episcopal Church, but this is a systematic model. I mean, I got whatever I got. But see, the difficulty is, if you don't believe in the Holy Spirit, you don't believe in the storyline, and you're not consistent. And that's probably what irritates people about me. And someone said this to me, if you're an advocate, if you're consistent, you tend to be, we're drifting into the St. Paul stuff, you tend to be not the Messiah complex, you tend to be an advocate. But what I like the word about, what is it? But the Paraclete, P-A-R-A-C-L-E-T. Yeah, advocate, Israel's champions, guardian angel, mediators of the Jewish literature. In other words, Ojibwe people are just naturally irritable, but they're mediators. I mean, it's not intentional, I mean, it's just, and we don't mind to laugh at ourselves, but the key is, if you believe in the advocacy, and then, this is kind of funny, I actually found the 355 pages of God Has Read free on the internet, on the deal here, and I skimmed it, but I read it before, so I piecemealed pieces of God Has Read, because that's really my theory of the two balances. Now, once I get out of this rabbit hole or the abyss of this requirement, then I could be a little bit more, the Acts of the Apostles, the journey of St. Paul. But not a lot of people believe that, because they get caught in the ritualistic of organization religion. They don't believe in the, going to Corinth. They don't believe, the other prophets and the Psalms. I mean, it's the context of a living faith, and I think that's what I get when I interact with Cortland and Cedric. What I do? I kind of like act out the faith, but they don't realize that it's almost covert, because I'm enjoying them, but I'm doing it in a manner of letting them. It's almost covert how I enjoy.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting. It's an interesting way that I think, and I'm convinced it's true, that that indirect communication. I mean, people talk about Indigenous people, use the word covert. I think of the word indirect. Some people use the word indirect, and I think what it indicates is a respect for the dignity of persons.
Yeah, and I'm not, and in a way, my enjoyment is the interaction, not, in other words, I'm not trying to put the camel through the needle here. I'm just trying to enjoy, because all the stuff I have is no different than what they have. We're just trying to, but in a way it may not.
You have faith in your own advocacy, right?
Yeah,
you have faith that by interacting in the right way, that good will come of it. Yeah. You don't have to force the good to come of it.
Correct, yeah. And even for me I know when I get through all this, when we're done, I mean, as we move along with these things occasionally, in the end, they're still not because they're so trapped in the Western model of learning. I'm willing to accept that, but I'm having a lot of fun
tweaking it.
Tweaking it. Well, thank you.